Hi, welcome to Head Start, the podcast for race directors and the business of putting on races. Well, it's that time of the year again. Run Sign-Up's annual race trends report is out for 2023, and it's larger and more comprehensive than ever before. Among the most notable trends highlighted in the report, we see registrations for 2023 races up from 2022 and tantalizingly close to 2019 levels, entry fees continuing to climb across most race distances and event types, and encouraging trends in younger runner participation first seen in 2022 carrying through to 2023 numbers. Well, with me today to go through the data, the trends, and their implications, I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast Run Sign-Up's Director of Marketing, Johanna Good. Among other things, Johanna is the person we all have to thank for compiling this invaluable piece of industry research each year, and with her help, we'll try to get a feel for where the industry ended up in 2023 and make sense of what the future might hold for race directors in 2024 and beyond. Now, as with race trends reports we've looked at in the past in the podcast, we'll only have time to go through the most important highlights from the report. So if you'd like to get your hands on the full set of findings, head over to runsignup.com, where you'll be able to find and download your free report copy. Okay, time to dive into the numbers and hear how the industry has been doing with Johanna Good. Johanna, welcome back to the podcast.
Nice to see you, Panos.
Well, it's great to see you. It's been a while. How have you been?
Been great. Getting back into kicking up for race season this year. So we're seeing a lot of movement and races getting ready to get set up. Looking forward to 2024.
How busy of a time is this for Run Sign Up and registrations in general?
It's not the busiest time for registrations because it's a pretty light month for races. But what we do see a lot this time of year is races that are getting ready to set up. So we have a lot of contact with race directors who are kind of looking to next year and thinking about what they need to do, to get ready for this year's event.
And of course, it's very busy for you this time of year because you do the race trends report, which we'll be getting into, right?
Yes.
It's been getting more and more comprehensive. It's been a real resource for the industry. You sort of manage this single-handedly, right?
We have help from, a couple of people in terms of pulling some of the data and hopefully editing, although we know there's still some typos in it every year. So, but the majority of it, yes, is mine.
Awesome. So this is, for people, for some of our listeners who've been with the podcast for a while, this is our annual tradition. This episode is coming every year, sort of around this time, which is we get to go through the race trends reports. This would be for 1 year back for 2023, essentially. So we're now into 2024. All the data from the 2023 events are in, and we're just taking a look at how the industry has been doing. Funnily enough, we started this, I think the first episode we did was in 2022, looking back into the 2021 report, which of course was a total disaster because of COVID and everything. Everything looked pretty dire. 2022 was a bit better, a bit of a halfway house there with things recovering and stuff. How's 2023 been, big picture wise?
Yeah, so I think we think 2023 is pretty optimistic. When we look at our data, one thing that we do, each year is look at races that are on our race in subsequent years. So this is only races that were on our platform in 2022 and 2023. And so that tells us, how much did individual races grow versus how much did our platform grow? And within that, we saw about 10% increase from 2022 to 2023 on a per race basis, which is obviously great. And then we can take that back a step further and look at races that were on our platform in 2019 and 2023 to kind of compare how those races are doing compared to pre-pandemic. And from that, we were at down 1% compared to 2019. And I'd consider that essentially even, there's always going to be a tiny bit of variation there, but that kind of suggests to us that we are back to baseline 2019. And maybe next year, it doesn't actually need to be running in 2019. We can just start moving forward and thinking about, growing from here instead of comparing back to pre-pandemic.
Well, amen to that. We're all looking forward to that. So basically you're saying that just to eliminate the whole thing of, how Run Sign Up is growing, you're just looking at the same races that have been around since 19, 22, 23, and you're just looking at participation within those races. And you're saying that 2023 is sort of at par with 2019 levels.
Yeah, correct. So that's taking out any growth on our platform.
Okay. And now just to take a step back, to kind of disclaimer we go over in all of these episodes, just to remind folks, why do we believe that all this data that's coming out of Run Sign Up is representative of the market as a whole? So you just mentioned, for instance, right, that looking at Run Sign Up races from 19 to 23, they look pretty flat, which is great. So we're back almost to 2019 levels. But why should we think that everything we're going to be discussing today about data coming out of Run Sign Up registrations essentially is representative of what's happening in the broader market?
Yeah. So, really the answer to that is just volume of registrations. We estimate that we're about 40% of market share in the US. There's no single aggregator of data on the running industry. That's kind of why we do this, because there's no way to do it across the whole industry. But from what we can tell from race listings and public listings, we believe that it's about 40% of the market. And that tells us that this has to be pretty representative. We have races across the country. We have races that are 100-person races. We also have races that are top 100 largest races. So we think we have a pretty good subsection. There's going to be little places here and there where we do think that something specific that we changed or did on our platform may have impacted a number. We try to identify that if we think that's true. But in general, we think this is likely how things are going to look kind of across the industry.
It's interesting because at least the sort of the perception I had of Run Sign Up until very recently is that you guys are particularly strong in the kind of grassroots level. And I know people, who are at that kind of level, starting new races or doing more community type events. Most of them, I would imagine more than 40% are on Run Sign Up. Do you see that skewing the data in any way in terms of what goes into the report?
No, because I think, yes, we have a lot of small races. But I think, most races are small. We do set up our platform so that it's easy for them. In terms of, it's really easy for people to come in and self-serve. They don't need to talk to a sales rep. I would say, with the possible exception of one other registration platform, most registration companies in the US are designed with some level of self-serve for smaller events, and then, perhaps more hands-on for larger events. I don't know. They haven't shared their numbers, but I would expect that that's actually pretty consistent across the country.
Okay, cool. I mean, obviously, I would say that, having 40% of the registration market is a very significant number of registrations of the overall market. So I think this data is quite representative of what's happening out there broadly. Now, going back on the numbers, you mentioned 2023 registrations were up almost 10% on 2022, flat on 2019. Is there anything in the data telling us sort of the direction that 2024 might take going forward in terms of this momentum that seems to be showing in the trend?
If you look at the 2019 to 2023, it is broken down monthly, and you can see a little bit of an uptick where the highest months were August, October, and November, which does suggest that this might be, improving even more at the end of the year. Other than that, the only thing that we can point to is that our numbers starting out in 2024 have been very strong, and we have seen an actual increase per customer revenue 2019 looking into 2024 as well. So we think that is true, but I think it's a little bit too early to say for sure. The other thing I'll just quickly call out is the way that we run this is actually not a full calendar year, or it's a full year, but it's not a calendar year. It's December of 2022 through November of 2023. And that is because we want to get the data out early in the year, in January, so that it's useful and applicable to people during the year. But just, if we're talking about a year ending in November, that's why.
Now, I know that you guys and you personally also have your ear on the ground on these kinds of things. And as we'll see with a couple of other things, and we've seen in the past, like price when people register and stuff, sometimes there's a little bit of a disconnect between what the numbers show and what people on the ground perceive to be the fact of the matter. So are you getting the same kind of like upbeat messages from race directors that they're actually feeling like things are going back to 2019? Does it feel like that to them on the ground?
Yeah, so I think in general, yes, we've gotten a lot of positive notes. The conversation around Thanksgiving races this year was amazing because across the board, people just kept talking about how much their events were growing. The caveat to that is, when we talk to race directors, and we've done a lot of face to face talking to race directors this year because we've been doing road shows, we've been on the road a lot. We were just around USA. The caveat is that a lot of our largest customers, largest races did not do as well this year. And so, if you talk to kind of that cohort, you tend to have a little bit more frustration still. But even within that, there is improvement. And I think everyone is feeling like the industry is back and ready to move forward.
Yeah, we'll get into this into that trend within large races. It's been persisting for a while. It's an interesting one, I guess. From the people that you see when you do your events around the country, do you see many new faces? Are there like kind of like green shoots, new companies going into the industry, new people doing events?
Yeah, it's always it's been pretty much a mix. I think at least of the 5 or 6 roadshows I've been at, we'll have 1 or 2 people who are putting on their first race, just starting out in the industry, and really want to learn something. We'll have a timing company or 2 who is there to meet other races and try to provide some of their support or their services, and then you'll have your large veteran race directors who've been doing this forever and are just hoping to find something that they didn't know and a way to think about things a little bit differently.
Since you mentioned race timers, yes, I don't want to digress too much, but since you mentioned race timers on this, we keep a directory of race timers, as you guys do as well. And I've noticed, just trying to keep up with data and cleaning things around, that lots of companies have folded actually in race timing throughout the pandemic. And we at least don't see many new companies going into race timing. Is that something you guys see as well? Do you see many sort of like new players in race timing coming in and taking over from the ones that just disappeared during the pandemic?
But I think there's a couple of things. I think, again, this one is not database. This is just from our observation. But a lot of timing companies that we've seen that have disappeared, gone away. There's a lot of, older adults who've been doing this for a long time. They've been timing for 50, 60 years, and they are kind of just ready to move on anyways. And there's sort of 2 routes that's gone. One is either the company just, folding and them recommending another timer to their races. Another option that we see often is that the company is still sticking around, but it's being taken over by a newer, younger employee who is coming in and stepping into that role. And so I think some of it is that those companies it's not necessarily a new company that's coming into the market, but it's a new leader within that company. Some of it is, there's some, really good, really aggressive timing companies out there who are growing a lot, who are expanding their markets. And they are picking up some of that. I do think we've seen some newer timers coming into the market. My perception is that a lot of that is, people coming in to the existing market and moving up within their company versus starting from scratch all the time. Although I have met a few of those too.
That's true. Actually, that's a good point. The whole early retirement thing has been quite big, both with race management companies and timers during the pandemic. Lots of people who, may have been 5, 8, 10 years away from retirement, they may have called it a day simply because of, all the tough times that we all went through during the pandemic.
When we did our timer survey this year, and I mean, actually every year we've done it, the majority of timers also have a full or part-time job. And so there are certainly people who do this as their full-time job and it's all they do. But a lot of timing companies, it's a side project for them anyways. And so I think there's people who are just like, it's not worth my weekends anymore. At this point, I'll get some time back.
Yeah, absolutely. So back to the race trends report. Repeat participation. That's something we also looked at last year. It's a very important metric. Explain to us why it's so important and walk us through what it's been doing, what the numbers have been showing in 2023.
Yeah. So when we look at repeat participation, we're looking at participants who ran a race in a given year and then went back to the same race the next year. The one note that I'll make on this that I think is helpful for understanding it's not quite as bad as it sounds, is that this looks particularly at going back to the same event distance. So, it's someone who ran the 10K at the Philly Marathon one year, actually isn't one, but we'll say that, and then came back and ran the 10K the next year and not a different distance as well. But I think even with that said, most races expect this number to be much higher, and I think perceive it to be much higher in their own events. Only 16% of participants who ran an event in 2022 came back and ran that event in 2023. And that's come down. It was around 18% in 2019. I think it peaked around 20% a year or two before that. And we have seen that, fall. It's gotten better since the pandemic. There was really, really low repeat participation during the pandemic. We had 10, 12%. And that makes sense because people who want to run virtual races aren't the same people who want to run in-person races. But we haven't quite seen it get back to where it was. Triathlons, ultra marathons, marathons do the worst. Currently, they get about, 8 to 11% of repeat participation. Shorter distances do a little bit better. 5Ks are at like 17% and 10Ks are at 18%. But it's definitely something I think people should keep in mind, that I think a lot of races take for granted that people who've done their race before will want to come back. And I think sometimes it takes a little bit of extra marketing to actually get there. We love seeing events that do good loyalty programs where they really provide early registration or a discount or some sort of special experience. People who have either run last year, or if you have too many of those to want to do it, who've run 5 years, start building up programs where people feel like they're really connected to your race. Because I think people, you really actually have to work hard to get people to come back every year.
I think all that makes total sense. To me, to be perfectly honest, I never got why people expect this number to be any higher than the sort of 20% that it is right now, right? I mean, I have never personally done a race twice. And obviously, I'm not talking even marathons, right? Which most people, I mean, if you're not local to a marathon and, people like to travel to these kinds of events, you wouldn't do it. But I wouldn't even do, I mean, I know people who do their local 10K every year, or like a nice 10K by the beach that they may enjoy and that kind of thing. But most races are bucket list type events, right? It's not something that you tend to repeat. If anything, what I'm saying is that I'm actually impressed it's up in the 20% to be able to get 20% of your existing customers, so to speak, back for this kind of event seems quite impressive to me.
I think, again, it's the perception. A lot of the examples you use are bucket list races, but most races are like the 5K down the street. And I do it every year because it's down the street and I know the person who organizes it. And so I think that sort of balances those large events that you're only going to do once, is a lot of the really hyper local events.
Yeah, I mean, on the other hand, I mean, as you were talking there, I reminded myself that you guys are pretty big on these kinds of like turkey trots and stuff like that, which
family tradition.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are built for repeat participation, right? It's like, we're all going to do it every year.
And I think race directors, when you talk about their perception, even a big, large race, they see people who come every year. They recognize those faces. And so they feel like they're getting people back because they're seeing the same people again. It's just they're not recognizing how small the group that actually is.
You mentioned earlier with regards to repeat participation, the kinds of things that people can do to increase repeat participation. I watched the webinar you did on race trends for UnSign-Up, and I took a note of what you mentioned there, which I think is really important. You said you need to find ways to remind people how much they enjoyed your event. How can people do that? Yeah,
I mean, I think you have several channels for communication with your runners. Websites, email, and social media. So email and social media are going to be the most useful for this, but even, making sure you have previous year's photos on your website. One thing that I really like seeing races do is actually setting up an email to previous participants who haven't yet registered, that includes a link to their personal photos from the year that they actually ran. That's tied to their results. They can include it as a quick replacement tag. Everyone gets their own individual link. And then it's a reminder, oh, right, I was there. I see myself. I see how much fun I was having. And it kind of personalizes the event that way.
I want to use this opportunity to just take a quick detour into what you guys have been doing with your emailing system, right? And I want to actually stress how important, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to stress how important it is for people to appreciate how much help it is to have an integrated email system. Okay. This is not a pitch. This is not an ad, but I just trying to get listeners, I hope, to understand what a big deal, whether we're talking Run Sign Up, some other registration provider, it is to have integrated email marketing, right? Because everything that you just mentioned, right? You want to send an email to someone who did the 5K last year, and you want to have their photo and a personal link and all of that stuff. You can probably do that in MailChimp and other systems, right? But keeping back and forth all that data, keeping it in sync, right? It's just a total nightmare. Whereas with an integrated system, you just say everything happens around data around the race and events. And you can say, for every participant that was in the 5K, do this and that, pull from the race photos, which is going to be a nightmare in other systems, right?
Yeah, it's a lot less downloading and uploading and hoping that you don't mix up your columns and send someone the wrong set of photos.
I haven't actually. We did an event on Run Sign Up a couple of years ago, like a race directors run during the pandemic, like a virtual run. So I haven't had firsthand experience with the new email system. How has it been? Like people liking it?
Yeah, it's great. So all of our Run Sign Up email goes through it. So I use it all the time. We send all of our newsletters and all of our internal communications, webinars and such through it. We've gotten really good feedback. I think we've made the final steps to actually close sending from the original version. So everyone from now on will be sending out of V2. And yeah, it's a lot more flexible, a lot prettier, a lot easier to do more. So.
And in terms of registrations, what percentage of registration comes through email? Do you have a handle on that?
Yeah. So, the one number that we can pull is registrations that come directly from our email system. And so in 2023, 17% of registrations across all races were directly from an email, which means last touch. So someone was on their email, they clicked on their email, they immediately registered. That doesn't include then, people who sent email through MailChimp and then registered, because that is then seen by the TrackA as essentially a direct hit on the website. So we expect that number will go up as people continue to, use email within the platform more and more. And I think, if we say 17% was from email just from our platform, we know that real number is even higher. So I would venture a guess that you're hitting at least a quarter or so of your registrations from email, which, means it's still pretty important to your marketing strategy.
No, absolutely. I mean, I was every single marketing episode we've done on the podcast that touches on email. Even when we're discussing other stuff, everyone would tell you, Andy Riley, who's a sort of like a podcast marketing expert, would tell you that it's quite up there. I mean, it's probably number one, email, right? I mean, it's a little bit old school. It's not the new shiny thing, but it is the most important thing. If you get it right, it's going to get you the registrations, particularly around price increases and stuff, which we're going to look at a little bit later in terms of, how important these are for getting people registrations. You mentioned the whole situation with larger events versus smaller events, right? The whole industry we saw has been growing, but it's been a little bit of a two-speed kind of situation. Larger events not doing as well as smaller events. You want to talk us through those numbers a bit?
We've seen this, since we started coming out of the pandemic, that larger races have been lagging behind, and we definitely saw that continue. So if we look at races that were under 500 participants this year, those races actually grew compared to 2019. So they were up 14%. Races that were kind of mid-sized, 500 to 5,000 participants, they were down about 5 to 7%. So still not quite at that baseline 2019 number, but within range where I think they felt around the same size. They felt like they're in the same kind of event, and they're on the way back. The largest races over 5,000 saw a 16% drop compared to 2019, which is obviously a pretty big difference. And there's exceptions there. If you look at the top list of top 100 races, there are races that grew. The majority of them, though, did not, and that kind of broke everything down. And I don't think there's one specific reason that we can cite for that. I do think that likely inflation and travel costs have to play in, because large events are going to rely on travel and on tourism in a way that a local event may not. And I think the cost of the race may not be that big of a barrier. Even if that's gone up, it's not that big of a difference. But the cost of the hotel rooms and the flight, and even just the decision to travel when there's been a lot more uncertainty around things happening, I think that's probably still impacting it. And I think just getting out of traditions, you've done the same races year after year. Some of that got kind of interrupted, and so it's been hard for large races to get back on people's schedule, get back in their minds, get them planning around it. But we've definitely seen a difference there between your big events and your small events.
We touched on this last year because the trend was prominent last year as well. And I was going through last year's episode's transcripts, where we had Bob Bickel there as well, who also said that alongside this kind of trend of broken traditions, he seemed to think that there's also, perhaps during the pandemic, there was a little bit of an erosion around staff, particularly with larger events. So lots of people moving on. So like that whole thing broke down. And I do hear lots of stuff. I've been hearing it for, going on a couple of years now, around issues events are having in recruiting volunteers, which I'm guessing that for larger events, that's going to be even tougher, right?
Yeah, especially if they had systems set up, a lot of larger events are going to go through community organizations. So if some of those relationships have been lost, that would be harder to rebuild, especially if you've lost the institutional knowledge of what groups to reach out, or the person who's at that group is no longer there. A lot of large events rely heavily on group volunteer participation versus like just individuals signing up.
You did mention that 1 in 3 of your top 100 races are still growing, which is a good sign. Let's remind people, I'm sure most race directors would not have a good feel for this either, of sort of the distribution of events, because, I speak to lots of people in the industry, particularly on the vendor side, and they're like, yeah, I want to get in touch with with a small event, something like 1,000, 2,000 people. And that's not small events at all, right? I mean, the distribution of events in this industry is completely skewed towards the very many smaller events, right?
Yeah, I think that is, especially because the race directors who are often going to be listening to a podcast, going to an event, about race directing, they probably do this with either more than one event or larger events. I think people don't realize how many races there are out there that are 97 people in front of someone's driveway for a loved one. And that really is just a massive part of the industry. Yeah, only about 5% of races have more than 1,000 participants, which is quite small.
Well, and the importance of this only 5% of races have more than 1,000 participants number is that if you think about it, total participation is very heavily skewed. Like it's basically made up of small events, right? Lots and lots of very small events. Like the top 100 races probably don't account for a significant amount of the total number of registrations out there.
Yeah. So, I mean, and actually we didn't poll, I don't have the math on the top 100, but I do have 12% of participation takes place in a race that's over 5,000. And the smallest race to make the top 100 list was around 7,000. So it's, probably under 10% of participation comes in, I'd say probably more like 6 or 7 at a race that's at one of the top 100 races. About a third, it's about 31% are people in, 1,000 to 5,000. So you do see a good bit of participation, within, not of races, of participation. Those races, a lot of people, that's what they experience. It's kind of your mid-sized to large event. But then, a majority is just running at small events.
Okay. Virtual races. They used to be huge. They used to be the only thing around basically a couple of years ago. They're now down to around 8%. So I noticed in the report, maybe you can help me understand the numbers here. So there's a number that says virtual races are around 8% of all races, and virtual events are 3%, thereabouts, 3.2% of all events. What's the difference between those two numbers?
8% is the events, like the percentage of race events that are virtual. The 3.2 is the percent of participants that are virtual.
Okay. So are we saying that 8% of races are virtual exclusive?
No.
So that they're just virtual?
8% of race events.
No, that they have a virtual component.
Yes. So of all of the events, so if we're counting, if they have 3 in-person events and 1 virtual event, then a quarter of their events are virtual of that race. So yeah, across all, counting each race event specifically, each race distance essentially separately, 8% are virtual, and then another 1.3% are challenges, which is another sort of form of virtual.
Okay. And across all of those, you're saying around 3% of participants participate in virtual events.
3% in a virtual event that's like a one-time thing, and then another 1% in challenges that tend to be longer-term virtual.
Okay. Looking back at 2019, again, which is sort of like, the reference point for pre-pandemic, that number used to be closer to 1%. Obviously, virtual races had like a massive, massive hike around the pandemic. Things are coming down. Do we have a sense whether we're heading back to the 1%? Like, are virtual events going to end up being as rare as they were before the pandemic?
So, I mean, we have continued to decline. So I don't want to say definitively that we are at the kind of bottom of that. I do somewhat expect it to stay above the 1% that it was before, simply because I think people now know it's an option. So, there's a race that, unlike you, I have done for 11 years. If I was going to be out of town and couldn't do it, I would perhaps be like, well, I don't want to break this. I'd like to do this virtually. And I think if people now know that's an option, we'll continue to see a small bit more than we used to. I don't expect this in any way to go back up. And I think it's still possible it'll continue to decline a little bit. But I do think it's an option that people now know is on the table and are kind of expecting if they can't do something in person.
I remember you guys back during the pandemic, you developed quite a lot of technology around virtual events and challenges and stuff. Is there anything are you continuing to focus resources on anything around that, challenges, any of that stuff?
In terms of new development, no, because I think we're pretty happy with where that lives. We do have some customers who use particularly the challenge software in like really cool ways and still do really large events on the challenge platform. But I don't think we have additional things that we have on our pipeline for developing for virtual.
Okay, like backyard ultras, I see, and those kinds of challenges are still quite popular. Like there's lots of, there's a couple of things that actually survived the pandemic, things like that, like people doing little challenges like that where mileage adds up, that kind of thing. Yeah,
and there's some nonprofits that, have a really widespread supporter group that do some really interesting things with activity challenges tied to fundraising. And yeah, so there's stuff that's like that we still see. But it's a really niche kind of market. And I think, not something that I would recommend for every event.
Well, moving on to gender trends, it's not the kind of thing that moves wildly from year to year. Female participation is still the majority of participation in races, a little bit down to 53%, but, still more women doing races than men overall. There's a figure that you added since last year on the non-binary category, which seems to be steady at around 0.2% from 2022. This is across all events, right? So basically it's just non-binary participants from the races that offer that option as taken as a percentage of all registration across all races, whether they offer this or not, right?
Yes. Yeah. So that, the feature was enabled on our end in spring of 22, I believe. But it's an optional feature for races to turn on or not. So we know that there's a good bit of numbers or races that have not yet enabled that. So I would sort of expect that to go up over the next few years as more races enable it.
one of the big ones, one of the big trends that I like to follow, lots of people in the industry like to follow, is what's happening with that very difficult to crack 18 to 29 age group. So we've been following that for a while. It's been showing some pretty alarming trends in the past of people in the 18 to 29 age group, participation within that group as measured as a percentage of all participants falling through a few years. Last couple of years, there's been an uptick here. So we're still down around 9 and a bit percent from 2019 in terms of the percentage participation within the 18 to 29s. But we're up from 2022, 6%. And 2022 was actually up from 2021. Do we understand what's happening here? Do we know why this number is sort of growing? Is it a trend we can rely on?
So I think there's a couple of things you have to look at a little bit long term. The report actually only shows numbers back to 2018, but we've been doing this longer than that. And I know around 2017, 2018, we saw about 20% of our participation was 18 to 29. So in 2019, that was down to 16.4%. That had already started falling. The pandemic accelerated that in a huge way because we saw that typically that cohort of young adults did not like virtual at all, dropped down to a low of 12.8% in 2021. And we have been seeing it uptick back up. We're at 14.8 this year, which, I think it's encouraging that it continues to grow. That's still not quite back where we were in 2019. And it's certainly not backward to where we were before that. But it is an encouraging sign that people are starting to come back. I think we want our race directors to look at different ways of thinking about reaching that group. We talked about email, and I am a huge proponent of email and how important it is, but it may not be the right way to reach this group of runners. So you want to make sure that you're trying new things, trying new social media activities. But I also think that a really strong way to think about getting to this group is to think about the things that they are attracted to. And we've seen, there's been a number of industry surveys put out that have said two things. One, this group really, really likes doing things with their friends and they want to be social. So making sure that you have opportunities to have your events be more social instead of just competitive. Having groups and team options, providing ways, social activities before and after the race for people to connect and really do things beyond just running together. And then the other one is that they really, really take seriously giving back to their community. So we know that most races already are either a charity or work with a charity. Really highlight the work that the charity does and how the race supports the charity, because I think that's a really strong way to get people to feel connected and to feel like they're running for more than just because they want to run.
Yep, those are points that keep coming up. I should say for people listening in that we have two excellent episodes on both of these things. So we did an episode with the DC half. We did a sort of like case study on the DC half, which I think they had like 30% of their participants being under 29 years of age, which is like a really, really high number. And there's lots of tips in that episode around branding and images and presentation and everything around how they made that event appeal more to a younger audience. And on the point about giving back and running for a cause, we have a great episode on partnering with charities, which is an important thing. Not every race does it. Many, many more races in the US do it than this side of the Atlantic. But it is a super important thing. And as you say, it seems to matter a lot to younger people. So it's a great way to do good, partner with a great charity partner that, by the way, can also help with volunteering and marketing and lots of other stuff, and get that young audience vote, which is really important. Now, moving on to another very important and historically slightly contentious statistic around when people register, right? There's been so much hearsay throughout the pandemic, and as things started normalizing coming out of it, of, people register later, or, lots of opinions anecdotally from race directors on the ground on shifting registration patterns and all kinds of stuff. Does the data bear that out?
Not really. I can't tell you the number of times I've been asked, like, when are people going to go back to registering on time? And I they don't believe me when I tell them that not much has really changed. Um, we've seen a consistent set of, 24 to 26% of registrations on race week as long as we've been doing this report. So since 2019, but also before that. That has been one of our most stable statistics. Is about a quarter of all registrations take place on event week, and it was just 24.8% this year. Yeah, there is a lot of variation when you look at distances.
Do you find at all that maybe all this talk about, oh, people don't register in time or whatever, they register later and stuff, just in some cases happens to be a misinterpretation in some cases of people not registering, and people get the feeling that people will register later, but then they sort of never do, unfortunately, in some cases?
It could be. I don't know. I think every race director just wants people to register early so they know what they need to do. And, unfortunately people don't cooperate. And I mean, I will say, like, while that race week number, it's certainly lower for longer distances. It's not actually much worse for even a 5K. It's only 27% for 5Ks, but certainly shorter events do see a larger percentage of registrations in the last month. And so, maybe what feels really last minute to people is they perceive it to be like it's at the very last minute, but it's really 3 weeks out, 2 weeks out, and not quite as late as they think, in their head.
Since we're on this point, we've had this question a couple of times in our Race Directors Hub group on Facebook. And since I have you here, maybe you can give me your opinion from the kind of like the registration provider side of things. Some people ask, when is a good time to open registrations? And I guess my gut feel would be the soonest, the better, I guess. Like, is there any reason why you wouldn't want to open registrations as soon as you have like a date and a location and everything set up?
I think in general, that's probably true. The one thing that you can do is, it's nice to have a big push and a big promotion for your initial registration opening. So when you look at when registrations take place, there usually is a pretty good uptick very early, and then a little bit of a die down middle of the cycle kind of uptick again, and then a big spike at the end. And I do think with your shortest distances, your 5K, 10Ks, people aren't thinking that far in advance. And so if you open a year in advance, people may not be ready to plan that far in advance, and you might lose out on that opportunity to get a big registration is open push. So I don't know that there's necessarily a one size fits all, but typically I would say, certainly most events should be open 3 to 4 months in advance, if not before that. And if for longer distances, I think the earlier the better.
I mean, there's a couple of races which actually send early registration emails like the week after the race, right? Like just very shortly after the race. And I can see that being very effective because, you have the whole hype from the race. You've done it before. Like, I can see that perhaps having an impact in repeat participation, just sending you an email straight after the end of last year's race to register for next year's race.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you're going to do a really early registration, it makes the most sense to do it close enough to your event that people are still excited about it and still, remember exactly how much fun it was versus 1 month later when maybe that's died down and people aren't yet ready to start thinking about the next year.
You also mentioned there, obviously, the significant difference that exists between when people register for a 5K or, say, a marathon or an ultra, right? And the data shows 50% of marathon registrations happen more than 3 months out, whereas for a 5K, 63% of registrations happen in the last month. Now, in terms of what that means for your marketing cadence and your marketing calendar and what you're doing throughout the year, if you're directing a marathon versus a 5K, are there any significant differences there in terms of the tools you'd use or when you'd be doing things?
I think probably the tools, not as much, but in terms of when you're wanting to focus your attention, you need to be ready to run right out the gate with longer events, triathlons, any sort of event that's going to require more training time and potentially more travel time because you need people to commit early. 5Ks, it never hurts to start promoting early, but, understand in terms of your ordering schedules, that you're going to have a lot of people late.
very, very important statistic as well from the report, pricing trends. So what's been happening with prices? We saw a really big hike for 2022 with all the, inflation stuff and the disruption in logistics and like the whole craziness coming out of the pandemic. What's the picture in 2023?
Probably unsurprisingly, prices continue to go up. Across basically all race distances, we saw increases from 22 to 23, and we're up compared to 2019 as well. Pretty significant amount. So, it ranges from 11% up for 10Ks compared to 2019. Half marathons are, not quite as bad. You see about a 5% increase. But across the board, prices have increased. And I think one thing that I can note on that is when we talk about average prices, that's looking at the kind of middle price. If a race has multiple prices throughout its race registration cycle, though that price is looking at the middle price, the average price across all races. But when we look at, the average low price, so where a race may open registration, or the average high price where a race may close registration, it's up on both ends too. So we're seeing throughout the entire race cycle that prices have increased.
Going back to the whole anecdotal stuff and what you guys have been hearing, do you find that perhaps race directors, particularly after the much larger price hikes of last year, are getting more comfortable with increasing prices? Because there was a big discussion coming out of the pandemic of some race directors, particularly people doing events for clubs and more like community type events. They were like, oh no, we can't increase prices. Although they were being squeezed on cost quite a lot from medals, from everything, they were quite hesitant in hiking prices. Still, there were some like double-digit price hikes in 2021. And are we perhaps in a place now where people feel more comfortable increasing prices, like everyone else around us, right? I mean, prices are going up every place around us.
Yeah, I mean, I think people just kind of had at some point they noticed the reality is their costs are going up, not just in terms of their race costs, their costs on everything are going up, and their races increasing are in line with that. And it's, it's the reality of if you want to put on an event, you have to be able to cover your costs. And so, I do think we heard less concern about it this year than last year, despite the fact that prices continue to increase.
One surprising thing, in terms of prices, the number of price increases. So this is the times, this is the number of times where a price would go, from an early bird towards the race day price. How many of those price increases you're going to have? How many of those steps, those tiers you're going to have? And on average, races are generally having fewer of those price increases, despite the fact that 26% of registrations happen around price increases. So that, like you would think that being so effective in terms of driving registrations, people would do more of them, and still they do less. Any idea why that is? Is there any way to square that?
This one is baffling to me because, yeah, we know that price increases work because people need a reason to finish their registration now, and to not put it off anymore. We saw a big decline around the pandemic. It's got a little bit better compared to last year, but barely. It's around the same. And I'm not entirely sure why we haven't seen those fully come back. The only thing that I can kind of think of is that races just sort of got out of the habit of their normal schedule of price increases. And so they haven't quite re-implemented the same pricing strategies that they had before. But I'm constantly surprised by how few increases there are. A 5K averages actually just a bit under one price increase. Marathons are at 2 price increases. Everything else is kind of in between there. And I think, if your race is open for 6 months, you certainly have time to increase your price, more than twice. And what that does is obviously, it provides that extra motivation, but it also gives you a little bit of buffer on the other end. Well, for people who may be really price sensitive, it means you can start the race a little bit low and you can give them a price that they are willing to pay to enter your race, even if it's a little bit below what you'd like to make on average. And then you'll be able to make up the difference for that because your procrastinators, your super late registrations, they're going to come in regardless of what your price is. So you can actually increase that price again at the very end and make those people who want to wait till race week pay a little bit more and pick up a little bit of the slack for people who, register really early for a low price.
Well, there's a couple of trends that come up in the report year after year that are surprising. This is one of them. The other one that I always find super surprising, but I've stopped talking about it. I mean, I didn't even have a question planned on this because it is what it is the fact that, what is it, like 3% of races or thereabouts, they give out female specific t-shirt sizes and 53% of participants are females. Like, have you ever been able to basically comprehend that? I mean, I sort of get the whole like logistics and like stocking inventory and things, but like, wouldn't you think that more races should stock female t-shirts?
So I have to believe that it's a little bit misleading and it's not quite as bad as it seems, because that can only track if people actually set the automated sizes in the platform. And so maybe they're calling their shirts like a fitted shirt and a relaxed shirt. And so they didn't set that as female sizing. Regardless, it's like definitely not as high as it's much lower than I would think it should be. And one thing that I did, this year is you can actually pull the percentage of female sizes, like what size they actually ordered if the race was offering female sizes. And it was 30% of people then purchased either a women's small or a women's extra small. Many, many, many unisex shirts don't actually have an equivalent to that size. And so if you have 53% of your runners are women and 30% of those people don't have a shirt available that will fit them, they're never going to wear your race shirt. They're not going to display your race and advertise your race for you. So it feels like a real wasted opportunity. I know it is logistically more challenging and it can increase prices, although usually with t-shirt vendors, they can mix and match men's and women's shirt sizes. But I think it certainly should be worth doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the number of times I speak to female friends of mine that I don't use many of the race t-shirts I get because, many times people, they're being really cheap on some of this stuff, which is really annoying. And then on top of it, to not have the right size, let alone the material being pretty crap. I mean, it's a total waste, and it is a literal waste.
Yeah. Just don't give it out then.
Yeah. Go plant a tree or something. I mean, there's so many initiatives out there that, do well, do good instead of actually, doing a race. If you're going to do a race t-shirt, do a nice one. Okay. Last statistic for me that's quite important is the whole trend towards mobile registration. I know this is obviously very, very important from your point of view, providing the technology and focusing on mobile registrations. The statistics specifically mention that 74% of race page views and 60% of transactions happen on mobile. So those two numbers, by the way, hint at another number, which is that basically mobile is slightly more tricky to convert. So more people view than convert on mobile, but overall, many more people view and convert on mobile. What does this imply for the race director? Maybe the way they set up their website or something, or the way they communicate or their marketing. The fact that so much of the economic activity and the registrations now happens on mobile.
So there's kind of, I guess, three things I would say from a marketing, just presentation of your event standpoint. Please check your race websites, your emails you're sending, everything on your phone. Race directors tend to work behind a laptop because it's a lot easier to set things up that way. But remember that that's not how most of your participants are seeing things. And so every time you are, making changes to any sort of front end information, you want to, really, really, really make sure that you've looked at it on your phone and if possible on multiple phones to see how it is actually translating for your participants. Secondly, making sure that your registration path is as fast as possible because, people have a little less patience on their phone. They don't want to be typing out answers to open-ended questions. So if you have questions that you're asking in registration that you don't actually need, don't include them. Make sure that, it's easy for people to get through registration. And if you have fast options for checkout, that certainly helps. We saw, since we put in Apple Pay, 31% of transactions on mobile, of transactions total, not just on mobile, 31% of transactions happened either from a saved credit card or from Apple Pay. And that suggests, people really just want to check out and be done. They don't want to be sitting there typing in their credit card number. And finally, I would say when we look at particularly at that transaction number, I think everyone knows that since COVID, QR codes have made a huge resurgence in a way that they never really did to begin with. People know what to do with them. When you're talking about race day registrations, there may be room for kiosks, but people are so much more comfortable registering on their phone than they used to be. We really, really recommend leaving online registration open and having QR codes on site that people can just go on and register for on their phones. And then you don't have to actually have a volunteer there helping with race day registrations. They're just managing it on their own. And that number implies that people know how to do that now. They're okay doing that.
So how does that work? I think I get the gist of it, but basically you're saying you have a QR code on race day, someone goes with their camera phone, they scan it, and then the registration journey begins on their phone.
Yeah. So races will have kiosks anyways, but you can still have a sign that says, skip the line, just register on your phone. And I've done that. We have a race that I've organized where we do an in-person pre-registration event. And before COVID, every year I would have 5 or 6 laptops and I'd have signs that said, you can do this on your phone with the QR code. And 3 people would use their phones and everyone else would wait in lines for the laptops. Since then, I only bring 1 laptop now because there's maybe one person who's actually, I'd rather use the laptop. Everyone else is just no, but I have my phone. Why wouldn't I just use my phone? And so you can just do the same thing on race day. And then your registration company just needs to integrate with your scoring software so your timer gets that information. And then you're up and running.
Yeah. I mean, since we're on that topic, the whole race day registrations thing, it used to be super complicated back in the day. I mean, it needed which is why people used to close registrations earlier, right? I mean, because then you have to think about, okay, how am I going to issue a bib? Then you have to get the person who registers into the timer's scoring system and all of that stuff. Things have simplified a lot, haven't they, over the last few years, I guess, right? It seems to me many more race directors are much more comfortable leaving registrations open until the very last minute. And it pays because lots of registrations happen on race day.
Yeah, I think, our real answer would be talk to your timer because timing software, it exists across the board to be able to, integrate with registration software so your timer can immediately have the data that they need. There's no reason to be doing paper entries on race day now, and there's no reason to be closing registration and losing out on those registrations. There's just, it's too easy to get people in now and to get that directly into your scoring software.
Now, that has been everything for 2023. 2024, you mentioned, we're already a couple of months in. You mentioned that early signs in terms of registrations and numbers and trends look really positive, which is great. I mean, just looking at the momentum, as you mentioned, from the last few months of 2023 and just, I guess, the general positive spirits in the industry, we're hoping it's going to be a record-breaking year until, at least in terms of what happened in 2019. What are you guys working on for 2024? What are sort of the big priorities? I know now you have a huge team and you're working on a million things, but what are the top 3 things that you're working on for 2024?
The ones I would call out would start with websites V2 should be out within a month or so. It's really, really cool. If you've been using the old website platform, you could make a new website that looked nice, but there's some certain limitations. This new website version is going to be very simple, kind of drag and drop websites. You can put any sort of component. You can pull data components, videos, donation thermometers into every page of your website. I've been playing with it for an event, and it's going to make a huge difference, I think, for events that want to have a really comprehensive website that's all automatically tied back to their registration data. Memberships is going to be really exciting. That is in beta now. So we do have a handful of clubs that are using it and are moving over from the old Run Sign Up Club platform to the new memberships platform. That platform has been, it's been an upgrade many years in the coming. We started it in 2020, and then obviously that got backburnered. And so we finally have a big update there. It has access to the upgraded websites, upgraded email. It can tie in discounts to your races, to your ticket events, auto renewals, a lot of really cool features there. And I think we're going to see a lot of running clubs be a lot happier coming into that. And then also just some opportunities to also do memberships for different types of organizations. And I think lastly, we have a lot of new stuff coming out on the ticketing side too. And I think one thing that we found in 2023 is there was a lot more crossover with our Run Sign Up and our ticket customers than I think we necessarily realized. We were a little bit cautious about not wanting to promote tickets too much to our running customers and make them feel like we were not focused on the running industry. And again, it's kind of one of those things we learned as we've done webinars and road shows, is that we get to the end and people would have more questions about tickets. And so I think what we've found is there's a lot of opportunity that customers are seeing in terms of events that they're already doing. Tickets for track meets or for parking are like really simple ways that we've seen races implement this, or timers and partners. But also like a lot of those events, they work with a festival and they have a race portion there. The festival needs a solution for their tickets. The race is able to bring those over. And if they're a partner, that can integrate into their partner share. But it also makes it easy for them to have the whole event kind of integrated together. And so I think we'll continue to see some adoption there by customers coming up.
I think I saw a post coming out of your blog overnight or yesterday about this new clubs functionality also allowing cross promotion with races, right? So that maybe it would be easier for a race to offer a discount to a club. So then, they get more club runners. And you also have a directory of clubs that people can search through and find local clubs through this. I think that was what was in the post, that you can find local clubs and you can reach out and offer discounts to local clubs from the Run Sign Up dashboard.
Yeah. And so that's always been one of my favorite features within memberships. This version, or with old clubs, this version is much cleaner and nicer. But one of the things that we see races do really successfully is, sort of works both ways. One, the race can reach out to a club and say, I'd like to offer your members discount. And that's a reason for the club to promote that race and for them to get more runners from their local community, which can be really good ambassadors for the race to begin with. And then on the flip side, if a club is organizing a race or even working really tightly with a race, the race can say, there's a discount for this club. If you're not a member, would you like to join the club? And so it kind of promotes both ways. It gives someone the option to say, actually, I would like to join this club. I'll get the discount. Then maybe I'll have a reason to go out and run on Thursday. And, both entities are able to kind of grow and help each other through that kind of program.
Awesome. I really like all these kind of grassroots marketing stuff. They're very effective, and outside of Run Sign Up, I guess they're very hard to do manually, because then you'll have to search clubs, find clubs, reach out. Whereas you guys have the clubs and the races. Offer
a discount code.
Yeah, exactly, all in one place, and it's so much easier. Well, this has been really informative. Thank you very much. I think that's everything I had for today. By the way, we should say, before we get into getting in touch with you, we should say that everyone can find the Race Trends report on the Run Sign Up website. The website is info.runsignup.com, but I think runsignup.com simply also gets you to the same place. There is a tab there that is I think knowledge base or something like that, and there's a bunch of reports. And you can not only download the 2023 report, of course, absolutely for free, but also past reports if you want to be comparing, looking at trends and stuff. So I think that goes back all the way to maybe 17, 16, something like that on the website, which is really helpful. Now, to the person who puts all this together, how can people reach out to you if they need to, take an interest in discussing some of this further?
Yeah, absolutely. You can always email me. My email is johanna@runsignup.com. It's JOHANNA @runsignup.com. Or if you forget that, just email info@runsignup and they'll usually forward it to me.
Awesome. And you're showing up at roadshow events as well?
Yeah. So I was at Running USA. We did a roadshow there in January, and I will be in St. Louis coming up on March 6th.
How much into the future do you announce this stuff? So basically, what does the pipeline of roadshows look like right now?
So we're doing 1 to 2 a month right now. I have a kind of tentative sketch of what the year looks like. And then about 2 months before the event, we start finalizing that. And usually about 6 weeks to a month out, we'll actually announce it. They're afternoon events. We don't have a lot of people who are going to need to have it on their calendar 6 months in advance. So we do about a 1 to 2 month advance schedule on that.
Okay, I would strongly encourage listeners to show up at your local road show, and they don't have to be necessarily Run Sign Up customers, do they? Can anyone show up?
Anyone is welcome.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to come on for another great traditional Race Trends episode. Hopefully we'll be seeing and speaking more to each other before next year's episode. So thank you very much, Joanna. It's been really, really helpful.
Thank you, Panos. It was great to talk to you again.
Well, thanks again. Thanks to everyone listening in, and we'll see you guys on our next podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode on the 2023 Race Trends Report with my guest, Run Signups Director of Marketing, Johanna Good. You can find more resources on anything and everything related to race directing on our website, racedirectorshq.com. You can also share your questions about the numbers in today's podcast, registration trends, or anything else in our Facebook group, Race Directors Hub. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe or leave a review on your favorite player. And also do check out our podcast back catalog for more great content like this. Until our next episode, take care and keep putting on amazing races.